If you're a photographer, you've probably heard this advice. You should always shoot at ISO 100. But what if I told you that's actually some of the worst advice you've received? Let's do an experiment. Which of these two photos do you think has the higher ISO? Most people pick this one because it looks noisy, but that's wrong. See, this image was shot at ISO 3200, and this one, the more noisy one, was shot at ISO 100. So, what's actually going on here? See, we've all been told the same thing: keep your ISO as low as possible. Because higher ISO means more noise, right? Well, not really. ISO does not create noise, it just reveals the noise that was already there. What actually creates noise is the lack of light hitting your sensor. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why ISO is not your enemy, but a friend that can actually help you in the most dire circumstances. It's time to finally see ISO for what it is, the hero and not the villain. So let's break it down from the beginning. See, when you take a photo, light enters your camera and hits the sensor. That light is made up of photons. The more photons your sensor receives, the more information your camera has about the scene, and the cleaner your image looks. Think of your camera sensor like a bucket. To get a good photo, you need to fill this bucket with light. Now, your camera isn't a perfect system. Because it's an electronic device, there's always some amount of noise already present. Think of it like a constant background static, and you can't get rid of it. It will be there. Now imagine this. If your scene has a lot of light, this bucket fills up properly. A lot of photons hit the sensor, which creates a very strong signal. And when this signal is strong, it completely overpowers that background noise. So even though the noise is still there, you don't really see it. But if there isn't enough light, the bucket simply doesn't fill up. And now your signal becomes weaker. And that background noise, it is still there. It hasn't gone anywhere. But now the signal and the noise are much closer in strength. And that's when your image starts to look noisy. And then comes ISO. See, ISO doesn't add any light to this bucket. It doesn't help you collect more photons. All it does is simply amplify whatever was already inside that bucket. So, if your bucket barely had any light to begin with, ISO ends up amplifying both the weak signal and the background noise. And that's why you see noise in your images. See, ISO didn't create that noise. It was the lack of light that simply made it visible. ISO just amplified it. The bottom line is this: when your sensor doesn't receive enough light, the noise becomes visible. And on top of that, if you use a high ISO, it just amplifies what noise was already there. Now remember this, because it's super important. And this is probably going to change how you think about photography. See, the goal should always be to maximize the amount of light hitting your sensor, or fill this bucket. Once you've done that, within your constraints, of course, you simply let ISO take care of the rest. And the more light you put into this bucket, the less ISO you'll need anyway. But the goal should never be to limit your ISO to some fixed number like 100. Because the moment you fixate on the ISO, you stop focusing on filling this bucket properly. And that's where the problem actually begins. Think about it. When you limit your ISO to a fixed number like 100, what you're actually doing is increasing the risk of underexposing your image. See, you can use the widest aperture on your lens and the slowest shutter speed you need to freeze action. But these alone will not always guarantee a properly exposed image. And let's say you do end up with an underexposed image simply because you selected a low ISO value. The only option you have is to fix the exposure in post-processing. And that, in terms of noise, is actually far worse than just using a higher ISO in camera to expose correctly. Let me show you. Here, I have two photos. One was properly exposed in camera at an ISO of 5000, and the other one, I intentionally starved the camera of light by selecting a relatively higher shutter speed, a narrower aperture, and on top of it, I set my ISO to 1600. Now, watch this. If I take the underexposed image and lift the exposure in post processing to match the brightness of the other one, do you see what happens? The image with the lower ISO actually has more noise, and the one with the higher ISO looks cleaner. It holds more details. So, what does that tell you? It tells you that ISO was never the problem. The real problem was that this image didn't get enough light in the first place because I underexposed it. And when you try to fix something like this in post processing, you're doing nothing but just amplifying a weak signal again. And when you expose correctly in camera, ISO amplifies the signal before the file is saved, which is often cleaner than doing the same boost later in Lightroom or any other editing software for that matter. So again, bottom line, ISO doesn't create noise, a lack of light does. So now, if the goal is to maximize the amount of light entering our camera, how do we actually do it? Fortunately, there are only two settings that control this: aperture and shutter speed. Now, in wildlife photography, we care a lot about freezing motion for obvious reasons. But the real question is, are you using more shutter speed than you actually need? Because every time you increase your shutter speed, you're actually reducing the amount of light hitting your sensor. A faster shutter speed means the shutter is open for a very short amount of time. So the camera actually collects less light. Less time, less light, which means the bucket simply fills up less. Now, there are broadly two situations where this happens. First is simple human error. You might have plenty of light in the scene, but you still end up using something like 1 by 4,000th of a second for a bird that is just sitting on a branch. See, now that doesn't make a lot of sense. You actually could have used a much slower shutter speed and still gotten away with a sharp image. So the key is to use the shutter speed you need, not more than that. Now, what happens when there is genuinely very little light? Very early mornings or late evenings, situations where light is just not there. See, in these moments, your first priority is still the same. You protect your shutter speed because more often than not, if you lose sharpness, the image is gone. So let your ISO go up 1600, 3200, 6400, whatever it needs to be. But there will come a point where ISO starts getting just too high. And that's when you have to make a decision. Do you accept more noise, or do you start lowering your shutter speed and take a bit of risk? And this is where experience comes in. See, sometimes you just need to hold your ground and take the risk. For example, this image. I actually shot this at 1 by 100th of a second. I mean, as a general rule, you would never choose such a low shutter speed for shooting birds. But the light in the scene was so low that I had no other option. Even at 1 by 100th of a second, my ISO here is 12,800. I did my best to stabilize my camera. I used a beanbag and somehow it worked. So yes, protect motion first. But when the light is simply not there, you have to start making trade-offs. And that brings us to aperture. And this is way more straightforward. See, aperture simply controls how much light enters your camera. If your aperture is wide open, more light enters the camera. If it's stopped down, for example, less light enters. So again, be mindful here. If you're already shooting in low light, don't stop down to something like f by 8 because that will just kill the amount of light entering your camera. Open up your aperture when you can and let more light reach the sensor. So between shutter speed and aperture, these are the only two ways you can actually fill the bucket. And once you've done that, ISO simply takes whatever light you've managed to gather and fills the gap so that you get a properly exposed image. Now, even though high ISO is not the problem, it doesn't mean it has no impact. See, you will still see noise in your images if the ISO is too high. So here are a few things that you should keep in mind while you're working with high ISO files. Avoid overcropping. See, one of the quickest ways to make noise worse is by cropping too much. When you crop aggressively, you're reducing the amount of data in your image and effectively zooming into the noise. Take this one for example. See, right now this looks just fine. But if I crop too tight, the noise becomes very visible. So, the tighter the crop, the more noticeable that noise becomes. So, as much as possible, try to get your composition right in camera so that you don't have to crop it a lot. Avoid over editing. Another common mistake is trying to force a low light image to look like it was shot in broad daylight. When you push the exposure or lift shadows very aggressively or boost saturation too much, you start amplifying the noise in your image, especially color noise. And that's when the image just starts to fall apart. So instead of fighting the conditions, just work with them. Let a low light image look like a low light image. Don't over edit. Don't over denoise. See, noise reduction can help, but only to a point. If you push it too far, you'll start losing detail in your photo and the image will begin to look soft and unnatural. See, a bit of grain is completely fine. In fact, in my opinion, it looks more natural than an image that has been heavily denoised. So aim for balance, not perfection. Find your camera's limit. Every camera handles ISO differently. So it's worth figuring out how far can you push your camera. Take a few shots in low light. Increase your ISO step by step and see where you're comfortable with the results. Not where it's perfectly clean, but where it is still usable for you. Because that threshold is different for everyone. Accept the trade-off. See, at the end of the day, noise is just a part of shooting in low light. And that's okay. Because a slightly noisy image that is sharp, well composed, properly exposed is always better than a clean image that misses the moment. And remember, most people looking at your photo don't care at all about the noise. No one is going to zoom in and say that, hey, there's noise in this image. It is usually us, the photographers, who overanalyze these things and make it a bigger issue than it actually is. All right, that's pretty much about it. See, always remember your goal is to maximize or rather control the amount of light entering your sensor. It's not to control ISO. In fact, ISO is the dark night that rescues your photo when there isn't enough light. And if that's really the case, think about it. Would you want to control ISO manually? My answer is no. And that's why I use auto ISO. See, keeping my camera on auto ISO allows me to focus only on settings that actually matter, the aperture and shutter speed. And the camera will take care of ISO every single time, as long as I get the other two right. This, in my opinion, is the best mode for wildlife photography. Manual with auto ISO, where you manually control your shutter speed and aperture and you let the camera decide the ISO for you. Give it a try on your next outing. And if you want to dive deeper onto this topic specifically, manual with auto ISO, I'll leave a link to a video I've made on this in the description. That's it. I hope this video made sense to you. Just remember this, your goal is not to take photos at low ISO. Your goal is to take beautiful photos, no matter what the ISO is. There is no prize for shooting at ISO 100. So prioritize exposing your photos the way you want. Bright, moody, dark, whatever that may be. And let the ISO increase if it needs to. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, consider subscribing to the channel. I am Shantanu and I'll see you in the next one. Take care and keep shooting.